The 1964 Alaska earthquake, also known as the Great Alaskan Earthquake or the Good Friday Earthquake, was a devastating natural disaster that struck Alaska on the evening of March 27, 1964. The quake occurred at 5:36 p.m. Alaska Standard Time and is remembered as one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. With a magnitude of 9.2, it remains the largest earthquake in North American history and the second largest globally since modern seismography began in 1900. This disaster took place in the south-central region of Alaska, affecting numerous cities and towns, including Anchorage, Seward, and Valdez. It lasted for nearly 4.5 minutes, but the destruction that followed was catastrophic. Massive ground fissures, landslides, and collapsing buildings wreaked havoc on the area, while a series of deadly tsunamis triggered by the quake caused further devastation along the Alaskan coastline and beyond. The backstory to this earthquake involves the slow but immense pressure that had built up between two tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Over centuries, these plates had been pushing against each other, creating enormous stress deep beneath the Earth's surface. When that pressure finally released on that Good Friday in 1964, the impact was felt far and wide, not only in Alaska, but also in places as far away as Japan and California. In the days leading up to the quake, there were no clear signs or warnings. The people of Alaska, much like the rest of the world, were caught completely off guard when the Earth began to shake violently that evening. The Alaska earthquake of 1964 was caused by the movement of the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. Alaska sits on the boundary between these two plates, which are part of the larger Pacific Ring of Fire, an area known for frequent seismic activity. For centuries, the Pacific Plate had been slowly pushing beneath the North American Plate in a process called subduction. As the plates moved, immense pressure built up where they met, and by March of 1964, that pressure was at its breaking point. On March 27th, the stress that had been accumulating beneath the Earth's crust was suddenly released, leading to the massive 9.2 magnitude earthquake. The rupture occurred about 15 miles below the surface, and it stretched across an area roughly 500 miles long and 125 miles wide. The force of the earthquake caused the ground to shake violently, and in some places, the land rose or sank by as much as 38 feet. In the first few moments of the quake, the ground motion was so intense that it made standing or walking impossible for anyone caught outside. Buildings swayed, roads cracked, and entire neighborhoods shifted as the ground beneath them heaved. As the earthquake continued for more than 4 minutes, it became clear that this was no ordinary tremor. People across Alaska were experiencing a catastrophe unlike anything they had ever seen. While the shaking was terrifying, the real damage was still to come. In the hours following the earthquake, massive aftershocks, some of them as strong as magnitude 7, continued to rattle the region, deepening the destruction. The impact of the 1964 Alaska earthquake on cities and towns was nothing short of catastrophic. Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, was hit particularly hard. Buildings that had once stood tall crumbled under the force of the earthquake. Entire sections of the city were leveled as the ground split open and buckled. In some neighborhoods, houses were ripped apart as the land beneath them shifted dramatically. The city's downtown area saw significant damage, with large structures collapsing and streets becoming impassable due to deep cracks and fissures. Seward, a small town located near the epicenter, experienced unimaginable devastation. The earthquake triggered landslides that tore through the town, and within minutes, fires broke out as fuel tanks exploded. But the worst was yet to come. Minutes after the earthquake, a massive tsunami hit the town, washing away buildings, docks, and everything in its path. The water surged through the streets, dragging debris and leaving a trail of destruction. In Valdez, another coastal town, the earthquake's impact was equally devastating. A section of the waterfront slid into the sea, taking homes and buildings with it. Valdez also faced a terrifying tsunami that swept away parts of the town. Waves as high as 200 feet hit the coastline, and residents who had survived the initial earthquake now faced the deadly power of the sea. Kodiak, located further south, also suffered from the earthquake's impact. The powerful shaking caused severe damage to the town, and within minutes, the tsunami hit, destroying homes and businesses. The water rose rapidly, submerging large areas and leaving destruction in its wake. The port, a vital part of the town's economy, was wiped out as the tsunami waves obliterated docks and boats. Beyond the immediate destruction, the earthquake also caused landslides and avalanches across Alaska's rugged terrain. whole mountainsides collapsed, and in remote areas, entire forests were flattened. The impact was felt far beyond Alaska, with shaking reported as far away as California and Japan. The aftermath of the 1964 Alaska earthquake was as challenging as the disaster itself. The destruction was widespread, leaving thousands of people without homes, businesses in ruins, and entire communities cut off from the outside world. In Anchorage, nearly every major building had been damaged or destroyed, leaving residents to grapple with the loss of their homes, schools, and workplaces. Temporary shelters were quickly set up to house those who had been displaced, but the scale of the damage meant that recovery would take years. One of the most devastating effects of the earthquake was the destruction of infrastructure. Roads and bridges were wiped out or severely damaged, making it nearly impossible to reach some of the most affected areas. The main highway connecting Anchorage to other parts of Alaska had collapsed in many places, and in the coastal towns, the destruction of ports and harbors left communities isolated. Relief efforts were hampered by these challenges as rescuers struggled to reach those in need. The U.S. military played a crucial role in the disaster response, deploying resources to help with search and rescue operations and to deliver supplies to the hardest-hit areas. Military planes and helicopters flew over remote parts of the state, dropping food, water, and medical supplies to isolated communities. Naval ships were sent to coastal towns like Valdez and Seward, where the combination of the earthquake and the tsunami had caused near-total devastation. The psychological impact on the people of Alaska was profound. Many who had survived the earthquake were left traumatized by the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. The constant aftershocks, some of which were strong enough to cause further damage, kept the population in a state of fear and uncertainty for weeks after the initial earthquake. In total, more than 100 aftershocks were recorded in the first 24 hours alone, and they continued for months, adding to the already immense sense of unease. As the initial shock wore off, the long process of rebuilding began. Volunteers and relief organizations from across the country came to Alaska to help with the recovery efforts. Engineers and construction crews worked tirelessly to repair the infrastructure, rebuild homes, and restore vital services. But despite these efforts, the full recovery would take years, and some of the damage, particularly in coastal areas like Valdez, was so severe that entire communities had to be relocated. In the years following the 1964 Alaska earthquake, the state gradually rebuilt itself, but the scars of the disaster were long-lasting. The earthquake left an indelible mark, not just on the land, but on the people of Alaska, who had to adapt to the new reality of living in a region with such immense geological power. Buildings and infrastructure were redesigned to be more earthquake-resistant, and new safety protocols were developed to ensure that communities would be better prepared for future disasters. One of the most important changes that came out of the earthquake was a greater understanding of seismic activity, particularly in Alaska. Scientists from all over the world flocked to the state in the aftermath of the disaster, studying the effects of the earthquake and the tsunamis that followed. Their research led to important advances in the field of seismology, including the development of better monitoring systems that could provide early warnings of future quakes. This knowledge would go on to inform earthquake preparedness efforts not just in Alaska, but in other earthquake-prone regions around the world. For many of the survivors, the memories of March 27, 1964, never faded. The earthquake had taken lives, destroyed homes, and reshaped entire communities, but it also brought out the resilience and strength of the Alaskan people. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and solidarity became part of the collective memory as residents supported each other through the darkest hours and rebuilt their communities from the ground up. The earthquake also left a legacy of awareness and preparedness. Public education campaigns were launched to ensure that Alaskans knew how to respond in the event of another major quake. Regular drills and preparedness exercises became part of life in schools and workplaces across the state, ensuring that future generations would be ready if and when disaster struck again. In the end, the 1964 Alaska earthquake remains one of the most powerful natural disasters in U.S. history. It reshaped not just the physical landscape of Alaska, but also the mindset of its people, creating a legacy of resilience and preparedness. While the state has seen other disasters in the years since, none have left a mark quite like the Good Friday earthquake, a day that forever changed Alaska. In the early 20th century, San Francisco was a city In the throes of rapid expansion, a bustling hub of innovation and ambition on the western edge of the United States, located on a narrow peninsula bordered by the Pacific Ocean and San Francisco Bay, the city's scenic views and booming economy made it one of the most desirable places to live and work. Its population was growing rapidly, and so were the skyscrapers, streetcar lines, and intricate neighborhoods that sprawled through the city's famously hilly landscape. San Francisco was coming into its own as a modern metropolis, establishing itself as a key gateway for trade and immigration. But as the city evolved, so did its risks. San Francisco was not only a marvel of urban growth, but also uniquely vulnerable to natural disasters due to its location along the San Andreas Fault. This geological fault line, which runs almost the entire length of California, marks a boundary where the Pacific and North American tectonic plates meet. In many ways, the city's very existence on this fault line was a ticking clock for disaster, one that only a few experts truly understood or worried about at the time. Despite these hidden risks, the city's expansion was largely unregulated. Construction was happening at breakneck speed, but building standards and safety regulations were lacking. With little oversight, contractors often cut corners, opting for cheaper, less durable materials. The city's infrastructure was also relatively fragile. San Francisco's water supply system, for instance, was outdated and poorly equipped for a growing city, let alone a major disaster. In fact, San Francisco had already experienced smaller earthquakes in the past, but these minor tremors were largely ignored or forgotten in the enthusiasm of the city's golden era. Throughout the years leading up to the quake, there were occasional reminders of the city's vulnerability. Some geologists and city planners had raised concerns about the need for better earthquake preparedness. Still, few believed that such a disaster could hit in their lifetimes, and even fewer had ever considered the potential scale of devastation that could unfold. As San Francisco continued to grow, the booming neighborhoods and thriving downtown districts became ever more crowded. The lack of formal building codes meant that many structures were vulnerable to even moderate earthquakes, let alone the powerful shockwave waiting beneath the Earth's surface. In residential areas, buildings were tightly packed, and construction materials varied in quality, creating the perfect conditions for fire to spread should an accident occur. What no one realized, though, was that the city was on the brink of one of the most devastating urban disasters in American history. In the pre-dawn hours of April 18, 1906, San Francisco lay quiet under a still dark sky. At precisely 5:12 in the morning, this calm was shattered as a powerful earthquake struck the city, radiating shockwaves across the region with a force that no one had anticipated. This wasn't a minor tremor, but a colossal quake that would measure an estimated magnitude of 7.9, shaking the ground so violently that entire buildings shifted and cracked within seconds. People were jolted awake by the tremors, some thrown from their beds, while others scrambled to escape from their crumbling homes. The quake's epicenter lay offshore, just 2 miles west of San Francisco, along the infamous San Andreas Fault. The seismic waves radiated quickly, creating destruction not only within San Francisco, but throughout the surrounding areas, including coastal towns and nearby cities like Santa Rosa and San Jose. The quake's intensity was so strong that it was felt as far north as Oregon and as far south as Los Angeles. The first moments were sheer chaos as buildings, especially those constructed without solid foundations or quality materials, began to collapse around the city. Entire neighborhoods crumbled, and within seconds, thousands of people were trapped or injured as walls buckled and roofs fell. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but the destruction it left was astonishing. The city's famous brick buildings and ornate Victorian homes, many of which were built without structural reinforcement, proved particularly vulnerable, collapsing in heaps or leaning at precarious angles. For many who survived the initial quake, the nightmare was only beginning. Gas lines ruptured throughout the city, igniting fires that would soon turn out to be as catastrophic as the earthquake itself. While the earth had quieted, the sounds of destruction persisted, with the snapping of power lines, the crashing of broken glass, and the cries of frightened residents filling the air. The city's infrastructure had also taken a heavy blow. Major streets were buckled and torn open, with deep cracks that made movement nearly impossible in some areas. The cable car tracks that connected neighborhoods across the city were ripped from the ground, and the central water mains were badly damaged. This loss of water pressure would soon prove disastrous, as firefighters scrambled to combat the flames now erupting across the city. San Francisco's citizens were in a state of shock, and their first instinct was to flee to any open space they could find. Many people rushed to parks like Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, seeking refuge from the collapsing buildings and the fires spreading through the city. At the same time, the emergency response teams and firefighters faced an unprecedented challenge with limited resources, broken communication lines, and no access to water in several districts. The scale of the quake's destruction was unlike anything San Francisco had ever faced, and it would take days to grasp the full extent of the damage. But as the fires continued to grow, the city's residents and officials realized that the earthquake itself had only been the beginning of a much larger catastrophe, and in the days following the earthquake, San Francisco became a city transformed. Fires raged across the city for nearly 3 days, consuming entire neighborhoods and leaving blocks upon blocks of once bustling streets in smoldering ruin. By the time the flames finally died down, an estimated 500 city blocks had been reduced to ash. Over 28,000 buildings were completely destroyed, including landmark structures, homes, and businesses that define the city's identity. The famous City Hall, an architectural marvel completed just a few years before, was left as a mere shell, reduced to rubble by the quake and fire alike. For the tens of thousands left homeless, the situation was dire. Nearly half of San Francisco's population of about 400,000 people were displaced. Makeshift camps sprang up in public parks like Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and even along the beaches. The U.S. Army, stationed at the Presidio, took immediate action, setting up tents, distributing food, and providing medical care to those in need. Across the city, citizens formed small relief groups, banding together to share what little resources they had and helping each other rebuild what was left. The destruction of infrastructure was catastrophic. Roads, railways, and telegraph lines that connected San Francisco to the outside world were severed, making communication and supply delivery difficult. Relief efforts faced major delays as supplies struggled to make their way through damaged routes. Yet within days, aid from nearby cities and eventually from across the country poured in to help the city recover. The spirit of resilience among San Francisco's residents shone brightly as people gathered to clear debris, rescue survivors, and rebuild their lives. The events of April 19th revealed serious weaknesses in San Francisco's city planning and infrastructure. The fires, which accounted for nearly 80% of the destruction, exposed the inadequacies in the city's water system and the lack of fire-resistant building materials. Officials and city planners took these lessons seriously. In the years that followed, new building codes were enforced, focusing on structural integrity and fire resistance, ensuring that future buildings could better withstand such catastrophes. Additionally, new water systems and hydrants were installed across the city to allow for rapid fire suppression, even in the event of a severe earthquake. The impact of the disaster extended far beyond the physical rebuilding of San Francisco. The event prompted nationwide conversations about earthquake preparedness and safety regulations. Other cities built along fault lines, particularly those on the West Coast, began to rethink their own construction practices and emergency plans, recognizing that a similar disaster could strike them as well. This earthquake led to advancements in seismic research, eventually laying the groundwork for what would become modern earthquake engineering and safety standards. As San Francisco slowly rose from the ashes, it emerged as a symbol of resilience and rebirth. While much of its historic architecture had been lost, the rebuilding efforts transformed it into a stronger, safer city. By 1915, less than a decade later, the city was ready to host the Panama Pacific International Exposition, showcasing its recovery and the new San Francisco to the world. The scars left by the earthquake and fires served as a reminder of the city's vulnerability, but also of its unbreakable spirit. Today, the legacy of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake lives on, both in the city's architecture and in the safety protocols it inspired. It was a defining moment that reshaped San Francisco, preparing it to face future challenges, while honoring the resilience of those who endured one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. On October 17, 1989, the San Francisco Bay Area was rocked by one of the most destructive earthquakes in American history. It was an event that would forever change the way people thought about the power of nature and its ability to strike without warning. The earthquake, known as the Loma Prieta earthquake, had a magnitude of 6.9 and caused over $6 billion in damage. It left a deep scar on the region and triggered a wave of changes that would shape the future of earthquake preparedness and urban infrastructure in the United States. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck in the late afternoon at precisely 5:35 p.m. Just as many people were heading home from work. It was during this rush hour when the earthquake's timing would prove to be especially devastating. The shaking lasted only 15 seconds, but during that brief period, it felt as though the ground itself was being torn apart. Buildings swayed and buckled, roads cracked and split, and chaos erupted all over the Bay Area. The epicenter was located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, near the small town of Loma Prieta, which is where the earthquake got its name. Though the epicenter was in a more rural area, the impact was felt far and wide. The city of San Francisco, along with surrounding towns like Oakland, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz, experienced some of the most severe damage. The earthquake was part of the larger complex system of faults beneath California, known as the San Andreas Fault Zone. The tremor was not just a violent shake, it was a reminder of the region's vulnerability to seismic activity. And despite the fact that California is known for its earthquakes, nothing could have prepared the Bay Area for the immense destruction that was about to unfold. In San Francisco, buildings that had withstood decades of earthquakes now buckled under the force of the tremor. Historic structures crumbled, and in some places, entire neighborhoods were wiped out in a matter of seconds. It wasn't just the buildings that suffered, the city's infrastructure was shattered. Power lines were downed, gas mains ruptured, and water systems were compromised. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming as people rushed to find safety, unaware of what was coming next. But the earthquake wasn't just a terrifying natural disaster, it was also a wake-up call. Many had known that the Bay Area was due for a major earthquake, but few could have predicted the sheer force and speed with which it hit. The suddenness of the event left emergency responders scrambling, and the vast scale of the destruction presented immense challenges for rescuers. For many, the reality of the earthquake's devastation didn't truly hit until hours later, when the extent of the damage became clear. As the dust began to settle and the ground stopped shaking, the people of the Bay Area were left to assess the damage. Buildings were reduced to rubble, roads were impassable, and communities were isolated. In some areas, the ground itself had shifted so violently that entire streets were cracked and lifted from their foundations. It was a stark reminder of the raw, uncontrollable force of nature. In the coming days, the toll of the Loma Prieta earthquake would be made clear. Over 60 people were confirmed dead, with thousands more injured. The destruction would continue to disrupt the region for weeks, if not months, as recovery and rebuilding efforts took hold. The emotional impact of the earthquake was profound, but so too was its effect on the physical landscape. San Francisco, Oakland, and other affected areas would face the difficult challenge of not just rebuilding, but learning from the experience. They would come to understand, more than ever before, how vital it was to be prepared for the unexpected. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a tragic event, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in earthquake awareness. It set in motion a series of changes in construction standards, emergency response protocols, and public safety campaigns. It became clear that no region, no matter how prepared, could ever truly be ready for the next big one. But with every lesson learned, the hope was that the devastation could be minimized and future generations could face earthquakes with a better understanding of what to do when disaster strikes. What made the Loma Prieta earthquake so memorable wasn't just its strength or the damage it caused, but how it changed the way we think about natural disasters. It would become one of the most important events in California's history, leaving an indelible mark on the people who lived through it and the generations that followed. As the tremors of the Loma Prieta earthquake faded away, a quiet panic began to set in. What had just happened? What was the extent of the damage? The chaos was overwhelming. In the moments following the earthquake, San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area were thrown into disarray. People, disoriented and afraid, scrambled to make sense of the destruction around them. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency responders rushed to help, but the scale of the disaster soon became evident. Rescue teams would soon find themselves working under nearly impossible conditions. The epicenter of the earthquake was located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but the damage was felt as far away as Sacramento and parts of Southern California. The earthquake lasted only 15 seconds, but in those moments it caused immense destruction. It was a reminder of how quickly things can change and how unprepared even the most modern, well-established cities can be for the wrath of nature. The city of San Francisco, already a bustling metropolis, was now in a state of emergency. Major thoroughfares like the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge were affected. With transportation lines cut off, Getting supplies into the city was impossible. The Bay Bridge, which connects San Francisco with Oakland, was severely damaged. The upper deck of the bridge collapsed onto the lower deck, creating a deadly mess of twisted steel and concrete. The bridge's collapse made it impossible for people to move between the cities, cutting off essential routes for rescue teams, emergency supplies, and medical aid. People who were stranded on the bridge had no choice but to wait for help. In neighborhoods close to the epicenter, the destruction was far worse. Buildings were reduced to rubble, leaving residents trapped under tons of debris. Entire city blocks were destroyed in a matter of seconds. Roads that were once smooth and easily navigable were cracked and displaced, making it nearly impossible for emergency vehicles to reach those in need of help. The damage wasn't just confined to buildings, it was the entire city's infrastructure that had taken a hit. Power outages blanketed the city, leaving thousands without electricity, which was crucial for medical facilities, hospitals, and rescue teams trying to save lives. Santa Cruz, a city about 30 miles south of the epicenter, was hit especially hard. The downtown area, which had been full of history and character, was now reduced to piles of rubble. One of the most iconic buildings in the city, the Pacific Garden Mall, had been partially destroyed. What had once been a bustling shopping center was now an eerie ghost of its former self, with walls collapsed and debris scattered across the streets. Local residents and business owners were now faced with the daunting task of figuring out how to survive in an area where nothing was safe. As night began to fall, the full extent of the damage became clearer. In addition to the collapsed buildings and broken bridges, fires broke out across the city. Gas lines that had been ruptured during the quake ignited, spreading flames quickly across neighborhoods. Firefighters, already overwhelmed with rescue operations, now had to contend with fires that seemed to multiply by the hour. The thick smoke from the flames made it difficult to see and breathe, creating even more chaos in an already chaotic situation. Meanwhile, search and rescue operations were launched in full force. Emergency crews worked around the clock, sifting through the debris in search of survivors. Time was of the essence, as each passing hour brought the risk of further casualties. Dogs were brought in to help locate people trapped under the wreckage. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, but the reality was grim. It was unclear how many people had been caught in the collapse of buildings, and the fear of aftershocks only added to the anxiety. As survivors were pulled from the wreckage, they were rushed to the few hospitals that were still operational. Medical staff worked tirelessly under intense pressure to treat the injured, but the conditions in the hospitals were far from ideal. Many were working without power or proper medical equipment, which further complicated their efforts. Across the Bay Area, stories of heroism began to emerge. Ordinary citizens stepped up in extraordinary ways, helping their neighbors and strangers alike. People who had never considered themselves heroes suddenly found themselves involved in life-saving efforts. These acts of kindness and bravery became a symbol of hope during the early days of the aftermath. For those who survived, the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake was more than just physical damage. It was emotional trauma as well. Many had lost homes, businesses, and loved ones. The city of San Francisco, which had long prided itself on its resilience and strength, now had to confront its vulnerabilities. The destruction had not just fractured buildings, but also fractured the very sense of safety and security that people once took for granted. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that recovery would take years. The extent of the damage required a complete rebuilding of the city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and buildings. Emergency response teams worked day and night, but the task ahead seemed daunting. What made this disaster so unique was not only its destruction, but the way in which the people of the Bay Area would pull together to recover. Through the rubble and the smoke, there was a collective determination to rebuild, to survive, and to come back stronger than ever. The Loma Prieta earthquake may have left an indelible mark on the region, but it also ignited a fierce spirit of resilience that would carry the Bay Area through the hardest days of its recovery. The Loma Prieta earthquake on October 17, 1989, left an indelible mark on San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area. While the initial shock was devastating, the ripple effects continued to unfold in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. What many did not realize at first was just how far-reaching the effects of this earthquake would be, not only on the physical landscape, but also on the social and economic fabric of the region. San Francisco, a city already known for its beauty, culture, and innovation, suddenly found itself grappling with the destruction of key infrastructure. The collapse of the Bay Bridge, a vital connection between San Francisco and Oakland, was a particularly crushing blow. The earthquake had caused the upper deck of the bridge to fall onto the lower deck, leaving a twisted mess of metal and concrete. Commuters who would typically rely on this busy route now found themselves stranded on either side of the bay. With this vital connection severed, the city was left to face a logistical nightmare, further exacerbating the struggle of getting emergency supplies and medical help into the area. Beyond the Bay Bridge, other major roadways and bridges suffered significant damage. The Oakland-San Francisco commute, which usually took a mere 15 to 20 minutes, now seemed impossible. The destruction of key transportation routes created a domino effect, further delaying the arrival of rescuers and supplies. The very heart of the Bay Area's transportation system had been disrupted, and its rebuilding would take years. As for the city itself, many of San Francisco's neighborhoods were unrecognizable after the quake. The devastation extended far beyond the immediate epicenter in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Downtown San Francisco, known for its iconic architecture and high-rise buildings, was not immune to the earthquake's destruction. Roads were cracked and uneven, forcing vehicles to maneuver slowly and carefully. Pedestrians walked cautiously as they navigated through the debris and wreckage that littered the streets. In the aftermath, large sections of the city were left without electricity, water, or gas, creating not only a logistical challenge, but also a public health crisis. Without power, hospitals were running on backup generators, and many businesses were forced to close, further exacerbating the city's economic hardships. The loss of life was tragic, with hundreds of residents injured or killed in the wake of the earthquake. However, the community's response was equally remarkable. In the days following the disaster, neighbors, friends, and complete strangers came together to support one another. Local businesses, many of which had been destroyed or severely damaged, began to reopen in makeshift locations to provide food, water, and medical supplies. Many residents joined forces to search for survivors in the rubble, risking their own safety to help others. It was this sense of unity in the face of crisis that helped the Bay Area slowly begin to heal. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the earthquake brought the issue of building codes and safety to the forefront. Many of the buildings that collapsed were older structures that hadn't been retrofitted to withstand a major seismic event. The Bay Area was no stranger to earthquakes, but the Loma Prieta quake served as a wake-up call. It became clear that stricter building codes were necessary to ensure that future earthquakes wouldn't lead to the same kind of destruction. This realization would lead to significant changes in construction standards and the way cities prepared for and responded to natural disasters. The collapse of historic buildings and neighborhoods left scars on the city's landscape, but it also brought about a renewed sense of purpose. San Francisco began to reimagine itself, not just as a city recovering from a disaster, but as a community committed to rebuilding stronger, more resilient infrastructure. The focus shifted to ensuring that future disasters would be met with preparation and resources capable of minimizing destruction. While San Francisco was undoubtedly impacted, the surrounding areas also faced their own set of challenges. Cities such as Oakland, San Jose, and Santa Cruz found themselves dealing with similar devastation, though on varying scales. Santa Cruz, located closer to the epicenter, had a particularly tough time recovering. The Pacific Garden Mall, one of the city's most beloved landmarks, was completely destroyed and entire blocks were left in ruins. Santa Cruz, a city that prided itself on its charming beachside atmosphere, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding from the ground up. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the emotional toll of the earthquake was just as significant as the physical damage. Residents were not only coping with the loss of homes and businesses, but they also struggled with the mental and emotional consequences of the disaster. The trauma of the event weighed heavily on the minds of those who had lived through it, particularly those who had lost loved ones, homes, or their livelihood. The sense of grief was compounded by the overwhelming task of rebuilding. Yet, despite these heavy burdens, a sense of hope emerged from the devastation. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a tragic reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of human infrastructure, but it also demonstrated the strength of the community and its ability to adapt and rebuild in the face of disaster. In the months and years following the earthquake, the Bay Area would become a symbol of resilience, showing the world what it meant to overcome devastation and emerge stronger. In the end, the Loma Prieta earthquake would have lasting consequences not only in the physical landscape of the Bay Area, but also in the ways that communities and governments approached disaster preparedness It forced a reassessment of the region's infrastructure, encouraged new legislation on building safety, and provided a clear message to the world about the power of earthquakes. Though the scars of the earthquake would never fully fade, the legacy of recovery and rebuilding would shape the Bay Area for generations to come. The Loma Prieta earthquake of October 17, 1989, left its mark not only on the Bay Area, but on the entire nation. The immediate chaos, destruction, and loss of life were staggering, but the long-term effects of the earthquake were felt for years. As the dust settled and rescue operations concluded, the task of rebuilding began. However, this would prove to be an immensely challenging and costly endeavor, with lessons learned that would forever change how cities and communities approached disaster preparedness and recovery. In the months following the earthquake, the primary concern was the restoration of critical infrastructure. The collapse of the Bay Bridge had made it clear just how vulnerable cities were when faced with a large-scale disaster. Reconstruction efforts for this vital piece of infrastructure took several years, with the bridge eventually reopening in 2003. However, the rebuilding process involved much more than simply repairing what was broken. The Loma Prieta earthquake forced the Bay Area to rethink its entire approach to infrastructure and building safety. This earthquake served as a catalyst for widespread changes in building codes and seismic safety standards. Cities across California and the United States looked to the Bay Area as a case study for what could happen when buildings and bridges were not built with enough resilience to withstand a powerful quake. Following the disaster, construction codes were updated to make sure new buildings would be better equipped to handle seismic activity. Retrofitting older structures to meet these new standards became a priority. This shift in construction practices reflected a broader, more cautious approach to urban planning that took into account the inevitable risk posed by earthquakes in the region. Additionally, the event highlighted the importance of emergency preparedness and response systems. While the emergency responders did a remarkable job in the immediate aftermath, the massive scale of the destruction made it clear that resources needed to be better coordinated. A more unified approach to disaster relief was needed, with more advanced technology, systems, and protocols to ensure quicker responses in future emergencies. Local, state, and federal agencies would work together in the years that followed to strengthen these systems, and they implemented various programs to provide better support in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Perhaps one of the most significant changes following the Loma Prieta earthquake was the advancement in public awareness about the risks of earthquakes. Prior to the event, many people in California, particularly those in the Bay Area, had grown complacent, assuming that an earthquake of such magnitude was unlikely. The Loma Prieta earthquake shattered this false sense of security and became a stark reminder of the region's vulnerability. Educational campaigns were launched to inform the public about earthquake preparedness, emphasizing the importance of having emergency kits, knowing evacuation routes, and ensuring homes and buildings were as earthquake-resistant as possible. Another long-term consequence was the economic impact on the Bay Area. Many businesses, particularly small local establishments, faced devastating losses. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt, and the cost of doing so was astronomical. The overall economic damage caused by the earthquake was estimated at over $6 billion, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history. While insurance helped cover some of the costs, many residents and business owners were left struggling to rebuild their lives from the ground up. This financial burden would take years to overcome, and in some cases, families and businesses would never fully recover. For some residents, the emotional toll was just as severe. The trauma of surviving such a destructive event left deep psychological scars. Many of those who experienced the earthquake firsthand struggled with feelings of anxiety, loss, and grief in the months that followed. The mental health effects were widespread, particularly among those who lost family members, homes, or businesses. Local organizations worked tirelessly to provide counseling and support, but it was clear that the emotional recovery would take just as long, if not longer, than the physical rebuilding. Despite the immense challenges, the response to the Loma Prieta earthquake also demonstrated the strength and resilience of the Bay Area's communities. Volunteers from across the nation came to offer their help, with people from all walks of life working together to support those affected. Communities that had been torn apart by the earthquake slowly began to rebuild, and residents took pride in their ability to persevere. The earthquake, while devastating, became a symbol of the human spirit's ability to recover in the face of catastrophe. As time passed, the Loma Prieta earthquake would also have an impact on how future natural disasters were handled. The lessons learned from this event that would influence how cities across the world prepared for earthquakes and other natural disasters. Emergency management strategies were refined, and a greater emphasis was placed on building stronger, more resilient communities. The final legacy of the Loma Prieta earthquake is perhaps best encapsulated by the changes it brought to California's approach to disaster response and infrastructure development. The disaster was a wake-up call that pushed the region and the world to rethink how we build, how we prepare, and how we recover from natural disasters. Today, thanks to the lessons learned during that fateful October day, the Bay Area is stronger, more resilient, and better equipped to face the next inevitable earthquake. The Loma Prieta earthquake remains a defining moment in American history, not just for the destruction it caused, but for the lessons it taught us about the fragility of human-made structures and the power of nature. While the scars of the disaster still remain, they serve as a constant reminder of our vulnerability, our strength, and our ability to rebuild in the face of adversity. The resilience of the Bay Area and the nation as a whole was tested in the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the lessons learned continue to shape how we prepare for the challenges of tomorrow.